and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. World leaders gathered in New York for the UN General Assembly condemned North Korea's supply of weapons to Russia's war effort. Meanwhile, North Korea is demonstrating both nuclear and conventional capabilities ahead of the U.S. presidential election. We'll discuss ways to deal with the threats posed by North Korea.
Putin's war has failed, and at his core aim. He set out to destroy Ukraine, but Ukraine is still free.
Russia has no legitimate reason, none at all, for making Iran and North Korea de facto accomplices in its criminal war in Europe.
It demonstrates our common resolve to cooperate closely on and steadfastly respond to any provocation by North Korea.
In the studio with me, Mr. Abraham Denmark, Senior Associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and Senior Advisor at the Asia Group. Mr. Denmark was Senior Advisor to the Secretary of Defense for August until June of this year. He also served as Vice President of Programs and Director of Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center and Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia. Also joining us, Mr. Ankit Panda, a Stanton Senior Fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Mr. Panda was previously an Adjunct Senior Fellow in the Defense Posture Project at the Federation of American Scientists. Mr. Panda authored Kim Jong-un and the Bomb, Survival and Deterrence in North Korea. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Now, Mr. Panda, at the UN General Assembly, world leaders called North Korea an accomplice to Russia's war against Ukraine and expressed concerns over Russia's possible military technology transfer to North Korea. Isn't North Korea testing its missiles at Ukraine battlefield the priority concern for the world leaders? This is the first time for North Korea doing this.
So that's right. The use of North Korean ballistic missiles in Ukraine represents the first time they've been used in an operational context. But I should note that before North Korea exported the missiles that we have seen evidence of being used in Ukraine, they had actually started exercising with them in their own country. And so these were missiles that had moved past the testing phase. So the North Koreans had a good idea that they would work, and I think they conveyed this to the Russians when they went shopping in Pyongyang for the first time in 2023. And so what we are seeing today is giving the North Koreans a lot of useful information, particularly about how these missiles perform in an air defense contested environment, which the North Koreans can't really study themselves. And so that is certainly going to be valuable to North Korea as it refines its missile capabilities.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Denmark, did the Ukraine war open the doors for North Korea to export its weapons in large quantities to Middle East and other areas? You've been in the government until very recently. Are U.S. officials concerned about increased weapons proliferation by North Korea?
North Korea has a record of providing weapons to terrorist organizations in the Middle East going back to the Cold War. So it certainly has a long history of this. And we have more recently seen North Korean ballistic missiles showing up being used by the Houthis. It's been reported that the Houthis have used North Korean missiles. So there's certainly a concern that North Korea is being more active in the international illicit arms market, both as a result of the war in Ukraine, as a result of its improving relationship with Russia, but also critically for them to bring much needed capital into the North Korean economy and raising money for Kim Jong-un.
And Mr. Panda, is the Ukraine war a great strategic opportunity for North Korea? North Korea is enjoying attention at the UN General Assembly as a new global player to upend the international system. It is enjoying boon in weapons sales, and it is also emerging as an important element in the anti-American axis with the Russia, China, and Iran.
So absolutely. The Ukraine war and the attendant changes to Russia's broader grand strategy vis-a-vis the West and its policy of confrontation has manifested in a tremendous opportunity for North Korea. And that opportunity, I think, is so substantial that it might actually fundamentally change the traditional interest that North Korea exhibited after the end of the Cold War in engaging the United States. And so, yes, this is an absolute opportunity. I think it's manifesting in Kim Jong-un getting potentially a lot of access to significant Russian technologies that can accelerate his weapons ambitions substantially as well.
As far as even nuclear technology, do you think, or ICBM technology?
So Russia's interest in nonproliferation is wound up in its own self-conception as a great power. The Russians see their possession of nuclear weapons and the fact that they are one of the few countries in the world that possesses nuclear weapons as a really important part of their broader identity in the international system. So that said, I don't easily imagine the Russian Federation willingly accelerating North Korea's nuclear weapons capabilities. What I'm far more concerned about is actually fuel cycle capabilities. This is the ability to accelerate the production of fissile material in North Korea. I think it's rather interesting that North Korea decides to show us a covert enrichment facility for the first time, not long after its cooperation with Russia deepens. I don't have any evidence to suggest that Russian assistance has flown in that direction, but I think it's certainly something we need to remain vigilant to. That's an area where cooperation between the two countries could certainly take place. One thing I will add also is that the treaty that was signed by Russia and North Korea earlier this year does include language on atomic energy cooperation. So the legal pretext for that kind of cooperation between the two countries has already been established.
That was a civilian atomic energy cooperation, right?
That's right. But of course, fuel cycle technologies can be very easily presented to the outside world as a peaceful civilian enterprise, when in North Korea, of course, that will contribute significantly to their ability to size up their capabilities.
And Mr. Denmark, some say the China, Russia, North Korea, Iran alignment is weak and this is a marriage of convenience, while others express concerns that they have aligned their rhetoric and interests and also closely cooperate militarily and diplomatically ever since the Ukraine war. Now, are these four countries becoming a major challenge to the US-led international system, and North Korea, formerly being a pariah state, becoming an important player in this equation?
So I think that they were right that it began as a marriage of convenience, and it's true that a lot of their interests don't align between those four countries. Their systems of government, they're all authoritarian, but the way they conceptualize themselves, the way they conceptualize the world, are incompatible with one another. That said, I think that relationship has evolved into something that is much more serious, much more consequential, into what they would describe as a cooperation against a Western imperialist order, what we would describe as the international system that those countries had previously signed up to. And they see themselves as really pushing back against this Western order. And North Korea is playing an important role. However, of the four countries, they are by far the smallest, and at least other than nuclear weapons, probably the weakest of the four countries. So compared to Russia and China, they're certainly not a big player, but this relationship is certainly giving North Korea more options, access to foreign capital, access to foreign technologies, and more ways to skirt around international sanctions.
And Mr. Panda, Director General of International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, said that North Korea became a de facto nuclear weapon possessor state. And this is an unprecedented comment coming from IAEA official. Given the symbolism of IAEA, wouldn't this characteristic undermine the denuclearization efforts to denuclearize North Korea?
So I really don't think the Director General said anything particularly controversial. The words de facto matter quite a bit. De facto is distinct from de jure. De jure would be very interesting because that would imply a level of legitimacy. All de facto means is that the nuclear weapons exist and we have to take them seriously in how we think about this problem. And that's really not controversial in Washington or Seoul, at least among our military planners, our intelligence communities. We have to take the fact of North Korea's possession of these capabilities as a serious consideration in how we plan to deter North Korea, to fight a conflict with North Korea if necessary. Denuclearization is an obvious conflict with this idea of treating North Korea's nuclear weapons as a serious consideration, but I think that's broadly the predicament we are now in. The aspirational goal of denuclearization becomes all the more aspirational and unrealistic as time progresses. And so I've long advocated that the primary focus should be deterrence and risk reduction, which does require taking those capabilities rather seriously. So in my view, Director General Grossi's comments don't really undermine much at all, and they actually correspond rather well to how many in our two countries, the United States and South Korea, think about this problem today.
But Mr. Denmark, it matters who says it when. Mr. Grossi is at the helm of non-proliferation international efforts. And for him to say this, is it really not so important? U.S. government does not say publicly that North Korea is a de facto nuclear state.
That's right. And I think it can sound like a semantics discussion about whether it's de facto or de jure. The reality is that North Korea has nuclear weapons, but the international community does not accept that. And it has put sanctions in place through the United Nations to encourage, to put pressure on North Korea to disarm. And the IAEA plays an important role in the existing global non-proliferation regime, and it's important that they continue to play that role. The challenge that we have with North Korea is that they extricated themselves from the international regime. I think a key point here that Mr. Panda made before we started taping is that North Korea doesn't care what the IAEA thinks. They care what South Korea thinks, they care about what the United States thinks, they care what China and Russia think, but the IAEA for them is a peripheral consideration. And I agree with Mr. Panda that recognizing the reality of the existence of these weapons is very different from recognizing North Korea as a nuclear weapon state.
And Mr. Panda, because of that reality, there's growing voice in Washington that the shift should focus towards arms control with North Korea and not denuclearization. There are many experts saying that, and President Trump recently said that he gets along well with Kim Jong-un, and it's a good thing to get along well with somebody who has a lot of nuclear weapons. And you were there when Undersecretary Bonnie Jenkins said that she is open to the idea of arms control with North Korea. Do you think there's definitely a shift from denuclearization to arms control in the United States partisanly?
There's no change in policy. But there is a broader conversation than there used to be about the tools in our national toolkit as the United States that we ought to be using to deal with this rather pressing problem to our allies, to our own homeland here in the United States. But what I will say is that arms control sometimes conjures up fanciful ideas of doing with the North Koreans the kinds of things we used to do with the Russians, things that we developed over decades of developing a common lexicon, a common sort of way of doing things, and that's very premature. What I would say is that a denuclearization process and a process of arms control or risk reduction more broadly construed would actually look very similar with North Korea in practical terms, right? The first things in a process like that would not be going into North Korea's ICBM bases or tactical nuclear weapons storage sites and dismantling things or disabling things. No, it would probably be doing the kinds of things we've always talked about in the context of denuclearization diplomacy. Disabling North Korean centrifuges, stopping reprocessing activity, so on and so forth. And so this conjures up this false dilemma, I think, for our policy conversations, that it's either denuclearization or arms control. The two can very much exist in parallel. But my critique has been that our excessive focus on denuclearization is actually us, the United States, and our partner South Korea, in a way putting ourselves in straitjackets in terms of the kinds of things we can't even think about doing with the North Koreans. And so we need to recognize that the problem has changed. The geopolitical context in Northeast Asia has changed dramatically since President Trump met with Kim Jong-un, for instance. And we need to recognize that to adapt to this changing environment and this rapidly growing threat, we have a lot more in our toolkit than we've been willing to give ourselves credit for.
Mr. Denmark, you've been in first-hand diplomacy and policy circle, and Mr. Panda said that denuclearization and arms control would look similar in the early phases, but in diplomacy and in policy, how you define it is very important, isn't it? If United States goes for arms control with North Korea, some in South Korea may be concerned that U.S. is recognizing North Korea as a nuclear state, and some South Koreans may even say that they have enough reasons to go nuclear.
Well, I think the question of South Korea developing its own nuclear weapons is a very different and a separate conversation than what's happening and how to engage with North Korea. I agree with Mr. Panda that engaging in what some would call arms control, some could call first steps towards denuclearization, look very similar. And there should be diplomatic ways for the parties to finesse this issue. That for example, we have a decades-old relationship with the People's Republic of China without having fundamental agreements on the status of Taiwan. And that was a roadblock for a long time, but we were able to finesse that diplomatically in the 1970s. And there may be a way to engage with North Korea with a similar sort of diplomatic finesse where we can engage with them, we can work on arms control, we can work on risk reduction without sacrificing our principles, without sacrificing our commitment to denuclearization. But a key component of that is that our allies need to be on board.
And Mr. Panda, North Korea is developing both nuclear and conventional weapons. And recently, Kim Jong-un oversaw successful tests of two types of missiles, one designed to carry super large conventional warhead and another cruise missile. Is this a recognition on his part that should there be a war on the Korean Peninsula, conventional weapons would be used primarily as we see in the Ukraine war?
So I don't think that's really what's happening here. I think the North Koreans don't expect to have the ability to sustain a conventional, intense war for too long at all. In fact, I think the U.S. intelligence community has said this in unclassified settings, that the North Koreans probably are looking to offset that inferiority with their turn towards nuclear weapons. What is interesting, though, is that you do see a full-scale modernization of North Korea's conventional missile forces. For a while, we might have debated why exactly they were doing that. Now I think we've seen one of the major reasons, which is export customers. When you have the Russian Federation interested in procuring non-nuclear missiles, it makes sense to have quite a few offerings. The other really interesting angle, though, is that the missile that Kim Jong-un recently oversaw a test for, they claimed that it had a 4.5-ton warhead. The reason that particular number is interesting is because South Korea has a missile with a 4-ton conventional warhead. And the North Koreans have done this in the past. South Korea tested a Hyunmoo ballistic missile with a 2-ton warhead, and a few months later, the North Koreans tested a conventional ballistic missile with a 2.5-ton nuclear warhead. So the argument I'm making here is essentially that a lot of this is also the North Koreans demonstrating to South Korea and to President Yoon that they can keep one step ahead of South Korea with their own capabilities. This has been a traditional driver of North Korea's defense activity and missile development capabilities, and I think that is precisely one of the signals being sent here.
And Mr. Denmark, what we see in the Ukraine war is that even though nuclear weapons is a good deterrent among superpowers, there's still a high bar to use their nuclear weapons, in which case, if there should be a war on the Korean Peninsula, wouldn't conventional weapons play a major role? And because of that, wouldn't DPRK-Russia military cooperation in the conventional area more important than in the strategic area? And wouldn't Russia be more willing to pass over conventional weapons than strategic nuclear weapons?
I certainly expect that Russia is more willing to share conventional capabilities than strategic, in that they would not fear North Korea with more conventional capabilities, but a North Korea with more capable nuclear capabilities at some point would become a concern for Russia, for China, for everybody in the region. But we've seen many examples of nuclear-armed countries having conventional wars, be it between Russia and Ukraine, be it between China and Vietnam, be it between India and Pakistan several times. And these conflicts are conventional in nature, but they all exist within the shadow of nuclear deterrence, which keeps them relatively limited in scale and scope. The concern that I have when it comes to the potential for conflict in North Korea is that because of North Korea's very limited conventional capabilities, because of the overwhelming capabilities of the US-ROK alliance, of USFK, at the conventional level, could drive North Korea to look at nuclear weapons as a stopgap in their warfighting capabilities. And the US has been very clear that any use of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons would mean the end of the regime. So the North Koreans, I hope, are very clear that that's a line that they should not cross, but it is also something that they see as potentially necessary to backfill their conventional shortfalls.
Mr. Panda, North Korea said its space agency spotted U.S. nuclear-powered submarine in South Korea on the 23rd at 10 o'clock, 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Very specific about the time to show off its capabilities. North Korea has successfully launched spy satellite Mallikyung-1 into orbit in November last year, but in February, South Korea said that it is orbiting the Earth without any activity. Is North Korea exaggerating? Is the Mallikyung-1 another space junk?
I can't say with certainty what Mallikyung-1 does or does not do, but what I will say is that I have seen evidence from open source space researchers who have observed Mallikyung-1 carry out maneuvers in orbit, which suggests that the North Koreans have an ability to communicate with the satellite, both probably uplink and downlink. And I don't think the North Koreans would gain anything from particularly emphasizing that they have an optical satellite capability if they actually do not. It's very easy to verify if an object is or is not carrying out maneuvers. And so I would say there is some degree of a real capability there. And for a country without any space-based optical reconnaissance capability, even a very rudimentary capability that might actually be worse than what we see, for instance, on Google Earth, might still actually be valuable because the North Koreans can reliably pull information from that satellite in a time of crisis or war, which also informs their ability to better understand the strategic environment.
Mr. Denmark, South Korea's presidential office said North Korea will likely conduct its 7th nuclear test around the time of U.S. presidential elections in November. The State Department said that North Korea is only waiting to make the political decision to do so. What does North Korea gain by conducting the 7th nuclear test around the time of U.S. elections? And if North Korea does go ahead with that testing, is there anything the U.S. can do other than warning North Korea of the consequences?
Sure. North Korea has a long history of attempting to influence our political decision-making and has conducted tests in the past and conducted provocations in the past around holidays, around other important dates in the United States. However, I think their calculus has changed since then. They seem very uninterested in diplomatic engagement with the United States recently, and they're engaging much more heavily with China, with Russia, and with Iran. So I think there's certainly an interest in signaling that North Korea can't be ignored, that North Korea needs to be taken seriously. But I think the intent of these tests, the signaling intent of these tests has changed over time. In terms of what the United States can do, I think, again, demonstrating that we are close and committed to our alliances, to our extended deterrence commitments, and rallying the international community to condemn this test, which again would violate international laws and violate international norms, I think is a very effective and reasonable response to a nuclear test if and when that should occur.
Mr. Denmark, you were senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense on AUKUS, and this week there was an AUKUS meeting by the leaders and defense ministers of the United States and UK and Australia confirmed ongoing consultations with South Korea, Canada, and New Zealand on potential cooperation under Pillar 2 of AUKUS on the development of advanced military capabilities. What can South Korea contribute to AUKUS through this cooperation, and what can South Korea gain?
Sure. Well, AUKUS Pillar 2 is the element of AUKUS that does not include the nuclear submarines, so it focuses on other advanced capabilities. South Korea has a very advanced economy. It develops fantastic technology. Its military technologies are very good. So I think ROK has the ability to contribute to AUKUS in a lot of different fields, be it AI, electronic warfare, uncrewed systems. There's a lot of capabilities that the ROK can bring to the table. And what the advantage of this is that AUKUS is a very unique mechanism in that it's bringing together the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom, three of the most advanced economies, advanced militaries in the world, to cooperate on issues to maintain and strengthen deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. So I think the ROK has a lot to gain from this cooperation, and it brings a lot to the table.
So if South Korea continues this cooperation in Pillar 2, would that open the way for South Korea to join AUKUS formally in the future?
I think that's a bit premature. Just my thinking here is that there's always going to be an element of AUKUS, Pillar 1, that's strictly trilateral. No other countries are going to be joining that. Right now, I believe the AUKUS partners are looking at bringing in other countries, be it Japan, Korea, Canada, New Zealand, on specific projects in Pillar 2, rather than some sort of formal mechanism. I don't think we're quite there yet. I think right now it's just identifying the projects that these other countries could participate in, could contribute in a way that makes sense for that unique alignment of 4 countries.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Panda, Mr. Denmark, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the 2 Koreas and the region right here from Washington.